सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Love had led Aziz Parwana over the dense high-altitude meadows of Yus Maidan, across the minefield separating the armies of India and Pakistan, and into a bomb maker's workshop. The Srinagar resident, you see, had set out to ask for the hand of his beloved Atika Bano from her father who lived in Rawalpindi. As custom mandated, there was a bride price to be paid. The explosives he would plant in the Palladium Cinema, the Hind Kashmir Hotel, and under Alochi Bagh Bridge. We have in effect to deal with a state carrying out an informal war, former Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru ruminated, but nevertheless a war. Exactly 70 years ago this month, in the summer of 1953, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and his Pakistani counterpart Muhammad Ali Bogra began a now forgotten effort to negotiate peace in Kashmir. The failure of that 1953 peace talk would lead on to Parwana's bomb campaign in 1957, the wars of 1965, 71 and 1999, the crisis of 2001, 2002 and 2019, as well of course as the long jihad that began in 1988 and is yet to completely end. Like it is today, Pakistan in 1953 was facing an economic meltdown and desperately needed to cut military expenditure. Like Bogra, former Pakistan Army Chief General Qamar Javed Bajwa was until recently pushing for peace with India for exactly the same reasons. But neither man could sign on to the status quo in Kashmir. The Pakistan Army unleashed covert operations against India even as the war of 1947-1948 ended. Led by Salim Jahangir Khan, a Srinagar resident working for Pakistani military intelligence, a cell shipped in 643 improvised explosive devices and 666 hand grenades, the Kashmir police alleged. Later in 1951, multiple government roads and bridges were set on fire. 14 conspirators were eventually tried for the attacks, of whom 9 were convicted. The accused who could not be tried because they were fugitives included Abbas Ali Shah, a superintendent of police in Rawalpindi, and Major Asghar Ali, a military officer serving in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. The architect of the campaign to seize Srinagar in 1947, Major General Akbar Khan, claimed to have been tasked after the war by Pakistani President Iskandar Mirza to set up a covert force that would target, I quote, unguarded bridges, isolated wires, and unprotected transport. The force, Major General Akbar claimed to have been told by Prime Minister Malik Feroz Khan Noon, later became operational under the command of Deputy Inspector General Mian Anwar Ali. The memoirs of Lieutenant General Gul Hassan Khan, former Commander-in-Chief of the Pakistan Army, record that these efforts were not confined only to Kashmir. Through an air transport service based in Australia, the general has written, Pakistan supplied small arms to royalist forces fighting Indian troops in Hyderabad. From Major General Akbar's account, it appears the designers of this covert campaign hoped it would precipitate a crisis, requiring renewed international intervention in Kashmir. And exactly that threatened to happen. Through the summer of 1951, violence erupted along the ceasefire line. The bodies of 2 Indian soldiers were dragged into Pakistan-occupied territory. 3 more Indian troops were killed days later. And late in June, a group of 60 raiders attacked villages 15 kilometers inside Indian-administered territory. Indian military intelligence reported that a division of Pakistani troops was being moved from Peshawar to Rawalakot, closer to the ceasefire line. In early July that year, India responded by moving the 1st Armoured Division from Meerut to Punjab, together with the 4th Infantry Division and the 2nd Independent Armoured Brigade. Further troops were positioned along the border with East Pakistan too. The war to come, Nehru brooded, would be, and I quote, neither brief nor gentlemanly, instead a bitter conflict full of suppressed hatreds. Liaquat Ali Khan, Pakistan's then Prime Minister, realized he'd reached too far and pulled his troops back. The story wasn't done though. Entering the harvest season of 1953, historian Christopher Clary notes, Pakistan faced a crippling economic crisis. The sterling reserves it had inherited from the United Kingdom at the time of independence had been all but exhausted. This foreign exchange crisis forced Pakistan to sharply reduce imports, and this in turn choked tariffs, the main source of government revenue. If that sounds familiar, there were even more problems than Pakistan faces today. Water shortages held out the prospect of looming food crisis. For all the talk on the streets of jihad without end over Kashmir, leaders of Pakistan knew the country needed to cut its military spending. And that meant seeking peace with India. Led by Bogra, the ethnic Bengali politician who had become Pakistan's third Prime Minister, Pakistan proposed to have a 3-day conference in London where both sides were to lay out their proposals to end the impasse. I quote, first day meeting characterized by a lengthy historical monologue by Nehru, which began pre-Alexander the Great and had not reached British period by the end of the day. The United States Chargé d'Affaires in New Delhi, John Emerson, moaned in a diplomatic telegram. The next month, at Bogra's invitation, Nehru visited Karachi to pursue the conversation further. To Nehru, it seemed that Pakistani leaders were desperate. Their appeals to me were plaintive, even desperate, he wrote in a letter to Ghulam Muhammad Bakshi, the powerful Kashmiri politician. And to Chester Bowles, the US ambassador to India, it appeared as if Prime Minister Nehru was, and I quote, determined to avoid agreement. Instead, Ambassador Bowles speculated, the Prime Minister would continue to avoid coming to grips with the situation on the general theory that if things were allowed to drift, the present status in Kashmir might gradually become accepted. Even though India was willing to settle on a division of Kashmir along what is today called the line of control, more or less, it was impossible for Bogra to push the idea through his cabinet. To make things worse for the politician, then Army Chief General Muhammad Ayub Khan, soon to become the country's military ruler, had growing influence over political decision-making. And the generals certainly weren't interested in a deal on Kashmir that would lead to the cutting of their own budget. The talks in Karachi ended with an agreement to appoint a new plebiscite administrator in Kashmir, empowered among other things with deciding the disposition of Indian and Pakistani troops ahead of a referendum. Within months though, the two countries were arguing about the nationality of the plebiscite administrator and the regional basis on which a referendum could be conducted in Kashmir. Late in 1953, the United States decided to supply military aid to Pakistan, fueling rage in India. From 1955 on, the influential diplomat Escott Reed recorded, Nehru began saying the only solution was to make the ceasefire line of the war of 1947-1948, and I quote, permanent with minor adjustments, with the result that Pakistan would get 1/3 of the state of Jammu and Kashmir and India 2/3. General Parvez Musharraf and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, the memoirs of the diplomat Satinder Lamba revealed earlier this year, came close to cutting exactly a version of this very formula. However, the grim events of 26/11 made clear that the top leadership of the Pakistan army was unenthused by the prospect. For reasons Musharraf and Singh would not have been unfamiliar with, various iterations of the same idea have collapsed repeatedly since 1971. Following the collapse of the Karachi talks, Nehru moved to consolidate his direct control over Kashmir, deposing Jammu and Kashmir's then Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammad Abdullah's government. Later, the state government charged Abdullah with seeking the violent overthrow of the Indian government. The so-called Kashmir conspiracy case dragged on for a decade into 1963 amid bitter legal controversy. Then, the theft of a relic from the Hazrat Bal shrine led to simmering political frustrations in Kashmir exploding. Nehru was obliged to release Abdullah. Subsequently, in 1973, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and Abdullah signed an agreement that returned him to power. And then, of course, the deal was swept away by violence less than 2 decades later. Like Abdullah, many of the actors in the violent theatre that erupted after 1947 found themselves embedded in the continuing tumult. Salim Jahangir, charged with running the bomb plot of 1948, was finally arrested in 1961 and tried in the Kashmir conspiracy case. The prosecution collapsed for want of evidence though, and Salim was released in 1968. He set up a poultry farm in Arizal, and that very poultry farm would go on to become, in his old age, a training base for a new jihadist group called Al-Fatah. In Kashmir, you see, the past is the present, a grim perdition from which there seems to be no escape for anyone involved. I'm Praveen Swami, and I'm National Security Editor of ThePrint. Thank you for watching Security Code.